In a typical construction project, there are literally dozens of documents that have to be executed as a part of the process. If we look at that in the form of a timeline of a project, what we find is that it is broken up into three fundamental phases. In the midsection are lots of different documents that are executed repetitively. For example, there are pay applications, requests for information to the architect, and several other types of documents that are submitted with regularity. In the early part of the job, there are many documents, though, that are executed on a singular basis and are necessary to get the job started. On the back end of the job, similarly, there are several documents executed to allow us to close out the project. So this would be startup here. Let's first develop a list of documents that focus on this startup phase and are typically executed in the early part of the project. The document on which most of the other sequencing is based is the contractor's proposal, or bid. The date of that document will largely determine the timing of most of the other documents on the front end. If the project requires a bond, then there'd be an application or some conversation with the surety early so that the surety could agree that they'd be willing to underwrite the bonds. A bid bond, if required, would certainly have to be considered, and if we were successful with the bid, then we'd be asked to provide payment and performance bonds. For each of these bond documents, if they're to be executed by an agent or someone that's been given authority, then each one would be accompanied by a power of attorney document. And related to these bonds would be an indemnity agreement that the contractor and surety would have executed prior to the project. Another document that might be part of the process to determine whether or not the contractor would pursue the project is a qualification statement, typically used by the owner and architect to decide if he's qualified to undertake the job. And if the contractor is successful in its bid, then at some point a contract would be executed. Sometimes we might also refer to that as the agreement. In some cases, there may be a need for a letter of intent to be issued. In other cases, there may also be a need for a notice to proceed to be issued. Once the owner and contractor are committed, there are several things that the general contractor would be required to submit, and we'll look at those as a package, including an insurance certificate, a project schedule, and a schedule of values, which is related to the application for payment process. And finally, we would expect a building permit to be issued as part of the project startup. Collectively, all of these represent singular documents that must be executed in the startup phase of a project. In the closeout phase, the documents on which most of the others will be dependent is the Certificate of Substantial Completion. And a related document, although different in many ways, is the Certificate of Occupancy. Other documents that are part of the closeout process include the Affidavit of Release of Lien, as well as an Affidavit of Payment of Debts and Claims, both of which would be provided by the contractor. Of the closeout documents related to the bonding process, the most notable is the Consent of Surety to Final Payment. Earlier, we mentioned that applications for payment are usually submitted on a regular basis, but during closeout, there has to be a final progress billing. Separate from that, we would also have the last pay application for retainage, which is a little bit confusing because we already associated final with the progress billing. Tied back to the Certificate of Substantial Completion on some projects would be a Certificate of Final Completion, although on many projects this is not required. And finally, there would be a package of material that I'll refer to as closeout documentation to be executed and submitted. This would include everything from warranties to operation and maintenance manuals, attic stock material, as-built drawings, and so forth. And depending on the scale of the project, these could be issued as a single package or could be delivered in phases.